Hi, I'm Gregg LeFevre, and this is the Compulsive Storyteller, a series of short personal true stories where we explore the idea that truth can be stranger than fiction. This week's story is entitled Con Artist. When Klaus called me the first time, he introduced himself in a heavy Danish accent, saying he was an admirer of my work and wanted to invite me to join him for dinner at Lockober's. I knew the 150-year-old French restaurant, but had never been there, in part because it was so expensive. I was mystified to discover why he wanted to have anything to do with me. While I had had some success in local gallery shows in Boston, I'd never received a call from a foreign art dealer who knew my work. When I walked through the lustrous black carved relief Greek revival doors of the restaurant, the maitre d' was expecting me and led the way across a wide dining room surrounded on three sides by carved dark mahogany walls bearing pilasters, columns, and detailing of all kinds, and filled with a large number of tables covered with white linen tablecloths elaborately set with sparkling silverware and crystal glasses. The most outstanding feature of the place was that it was very dark. Klaus was seated at what seemed like one of the best seats in the house, between a mahogany column on one side and a fan palm on the other. As soon as he saw me, he pushed back his heavy dark red leather chair and welcomed me. He was dressed in the fashion of Northern Europe, all tweedy, vested, and layered, then bid me to sit down, apologizing for ordering his drink without me, and asked me what I would like. I had no idea what to order in such a place, so I asked him to recommend a French white wine. After perusing the wine list, he ordered something, pronouncing it in perfect French, at least to my ear. Looking at him, I would describe his manner as professorial and avuncular, a Danish Sherlock Holmes. He asked my permission to order the meal for me, since he knew the menu well, and I let him do so. And then he began to question me. "So, Gregg, I hope you don't mind me calling you by your given name. When did you start doing art?" I responded simply, "Kindergarten," and that made him knit his heavy eyebrows. "Really?" he responded. "How would you describe your first artworks?" I answered, "Like most kids, families of stick figures to begin with, but I particularly like drawing branching structures of trees, and over time they became much more refined and almost hyper-realistic." Then Klaus asked, "What came next?" And I responded, "The figures in my work evolved in a more modernist direction. That's when I moved from being a painter and drawer to being a sculptor, working three-dimensionally. Archipenko was my hero." At this point, I decided to turn the tables and ask Klaus some questions. "Do you have a gallery?" He answered, "Yes, several, one in Copenhagen and another in a small Danish town." I followed up with, "Are you a collector?" And Klaus answered, "Oh, of course. You can't be a gallerist without being a collector." I asked, "Which do you prefer?" Klaus continued, "They're just two sides of the same coin." We had a completely enjoyable dinner, sumptuous, delicious, and paired with way too many glasses of wine. As we parted company on the street outside Lockober's, he said to me he was only in town for one more day, so could he visit my studio the next morning. I agreed to his visit and somehow managed to drive drunk, very slowly mind you, back to my studio in Waltham, a gritty little factory town west of Boston. At 10 a.m., my studio buzzer rang. He arrived exactly on time. As he looked around my studio, he was enthusiastic about the small 8-inch by 8-inch bronze square reliefs I'd made by taking castings from rock textures that looked like aerial photos. Then I polished selected veins and river shapes, which juxtaposed well with the raw, rougher rock textures. As he walked around my studio space and looked at my larger reliefs, which were not bronze but made of cast paper pulp, his comments were informed and astute. He said, "I very much like the push-pull, the off-balance qualities created by the deeper and shallower relief work." Then he went on to say, "The smaller polished bronzes and the rougher large cast paper pieces are very different. I prefer the bronzes." This was the first thing he said that I did not agree with. The average viewer liked the sparkle and shine of the bronze, but for me, the cast paper pulp pieces were much more original and interesting, not small and precious like the bronzes. But I suspect that Klaus knew that they would be much more saleable. On a large work table in my studio, he began to assemble a collection of half a dozen of the bronzes. He then wrapped them with some padding that I gave him and placed them in a fine leather suitcase he'd brought with him. "So here's what I would like to propose, Monsieur LeFevre," he said with an all-knowing smile. "I'd like to give you a one-person show at my gallery in Copenhagen. When I get back to Denmark, I'm going to sell these pieces to a number of my regular collectors who trust my judgment, including the U.S. ambassador to Denmark. These sales will help promote your show. I will do a full-color catalog of the exhibition with an introduction by a well-known Dutch art critic. I hope to create such a buzz about your work that I'll be able to sell out the entire show before it even opens." So what do you say? Do you like the idea of all those red dots? Klaus then told me he had a plane to catch, and actually gave me a big bear hug before he walked out of my studio with half a dozen of my works in his bag. A few days later, I was sharing the good news of my show with a friend from Toronto. When I mentioned the name Klaus Domkær, he said with alarm in his voice, "What? Klaus Domkær?" Then he continued, "Gregg, let me tell you about Klaus." His tale of woe blew my mind, and he promised to send me a 1980 article from the Toronto Star entitled, "The Art Scamming of $1 Million." When the article arrived, I was horrified. Much of what follows I've paraphrased from the article. It began, "The Great Hamilton Art Scam. Klaus Domkær opened his gallery, the Domkær Burton Gallery in Hamilton, Ontario, showing a mix of established artists, European masters, and emerging local artists. He catered to a newly minted middle class of business professionals looking to show off their artistic taste. The added bonus was that these doctors, lawyers, and dentists could decorate their offices with leased or purchased works and then write them off as a business expense on their federal taxes." The Toronto Star said about the gallerist, quote, "Klaus Domkær, an amiable, charming 57-year-old Dane, was a fixture in the Canadian art scene for 15 years. A dealer and gallery owner with impeccable credentials, he was short and balding, with a heavy Danish accent. His knowledge and appreciation of art was great, but his greed was greater." End quote. The scam began when these professionals wanted to switch out their artwork for something new and fresh. Klaus happily offered them a replacement that, unknown to the buyer, was worth far less than the original work of art. He also sold outright works belonging to his collectors in other galleries and then never paid them for the works. This went on for years until the Canadian tax law was changed and writing off office art came to an abrupt end. Quoting the Toronto Star again, quote, "As news of the scandal spread, collectors were shocked. One client said, 'Nobody ever asked him for anything in writing. We took what he said about the value of a painting, about its authenticity, about everything, on trust.'" Warren Buffett's famous quote, "You don't know who's not wearing a bathing suit until the tide goes out," would certainly have applied in this situation. During the investigation, his scams and cons kept piling up, leading to 17 counts of fraud from the Ontario Provincial Police totaling $240,000. One count of document forgery and one count of theft of a painting from the Niagara Regional Police, one count of breaking and entering, one count of theft of a painting, and one count of failing to appear at court from the Hamilton Regional Police, along with numerous other charges from different authorities. But when they got all of their ducks in a row and it was time for an arrest, Domkær was gone. His gallery cleared out, his paintings and money nowhere to be found. Once he left, his house of cards completely collapsed, and the emerging Hamilton art scene was over. The Toronto Star wrote, quote, "The city was just getting adventurous. Abstract painting, experimental art, and new artists were beginning to take off. Now it was back to prints of wildflowers and barns, if anybody was still buying art at all." unquote. But even when faced with a mountain of evidence of his crimes, Klaus maintained his innocence and that he was the wronged party. His collectors and associates all owed him money. Fleeing to New York, then to California, he was eventually held there on an illegal immigration warrant. But once again, he slipped away, posting bond and jumping bail, heading from Texas back to Denmark by way of Boston. Epilogue. This was the point at which Klaus invited me to dinner at Lockober's. He'd just gone through this incredible 15-year-long streak of cons and escapes when he calmly sat down to dinner with me. In one of the articles about him in the press, they quoted the name of an Interpol agent who was in charge of the case against Klaus Domkjær in Europe. I was able to get in touch with Interpol and finally with the agent himself and told him about my experiences with Klaus. The agent was very interested in the fact that Klaus was going to give me a show at his Gallery Helliggeist in Copenhagen and asked me if I'd be willing to take part in a sting operation against him and possibly recover the artworks he'd stolen from me. I was of course interested and said I'd be happy to help. The one thing I remember about the conversation was that the agent said, and here I'm paraphrasing, "The thing about Klaus that's amazing is that he just can't help himself. He's on the run from the authorities in Canada and Texas, and he still has time to stop in Boston and rip off some of your work. And your art is small potatoes compared with the Picassos and the like that he'd stolen in Canada." My feelings were hurt, but I knew that he was right. So we set up a sting and a series of telephone calls between Interpol's offices in Europe and me in Boston. From my studio there, they arranged for me to call Klaus at his Gallery Helliggeist in Copenhagen, with them listening in. When the man himself actually answered the call, his voice was unmistakable. He said that the gallery owner was not available and he didn't know when he'd be back. Shortly after that, Interpol agents showed up at the gallery and he'd flown the coop, tipped off by the call, and there was nothing to be found. No art, no money, no records of any kind. The Interpol agent I'd been talking to said that Klaus probably already had galleries set up in other parts of the world where he could begin again with more of his scams. I don't believe he was ever caught, so I kissed my small bronzes goodbye, thankful I hadn't actually delivered a couple dozen larger works for my solo show at Gallery Helliggeist. Helliggeist can mean Holy Spirit or Holy Ghost. Klaus Domkjær had now ghosted for good. Are you ready to tell your own story on The Compulsive Storyteller? We're launching a new segment of guest storytelling, and we want to hear your stories. Email a voice recording to hello@thecompulsivestoryteller.com. I'll play selected stories on upcoming episodes. Try to be as clear as possible in your recording, and we reserve the right to lightly edit them for length and clarity. Leave your name or contact information in your voicemail or email, and let us know if you'd like the story to be anonymous. I can't wait to hear from you. The Compulsive Storyteller is now co-produced by Gregg LeFevre and Fadia Montserrat, who's also arranged the music and created the special effects. Emily Ramon does design, research, editing, and marketing. Peter Kokoma has made our theme music and for many seasons co-produced the show with me. If you enjoyed this week's episode, let us know. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at The Compulsive Storyteller, and we'd love to hear from you. This podcast is independently produced, so we really appreciate all your help and support. Share the show with your friends, subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and please leave a review. You can also check out our website, thecompulsivestoryteller.com, for more information. Thanks for listening, and if you didn't like this one, the next one will be another story. All characters and events portrayed in this podcast are based on my truth, with some names and facts changed for privacy. The conversations and dialogues are based on my best memory, but are not word-for-word recreations.